This project was very good for me in a social context, as the first brief was, in this case, one that paired me up with someone who already had a social circle before the start of the course. My partner to whom this work had to relate was Harjit Dogra, one of the students who had progressed onto this course from the Access course, along with Ro, Kima and Anshu. The initial dialogue part of this brief gave very fruitful results, as there were several themes that could be expanded upon. The main ones of these, which I decided to progress with, were Harj's love of travel, particularly to the places where his family comes from, his love of good food and of cooking, his hobby, that is, the martial art form of Krav Maga, and his admiration of the work of Saul Bass. I decided at this point that my designs would benefit from a limitation to using block fill in my colours, as, although he claimed at first to lack any favouritism in colours, he did announce that he prefers anything matte or flat. After this dialogue, I went on to look at travel magazines and shops, cookery books and menus, imagery associated with Krav Maga, and some of the work of Saul Bass. On the travel theme, I had plenty of options as to where I could have taken it, but some of these options had already been used in examples we had been given, so would have at least seemed to have been copied from those. Other options that I could have followed along this route, though promising, did not inspire me in the way that is needed for a truly successful piece of design work. The cooking theme was more inspiring, as I was encouraged by the idea of making recipes for parts of his life, and could have done a menu based on Harj's place of work at his father's restaurant. I was put off this theme when we were given a menu brief alongside this one, as I feared it would become too repetitive to present food for two separate pieces of work. Krav Maga was the most disappointing of those which I had thought to progress with. Although it allowed for a broad set colour scheme and logo design, there was very little graphic imagery that I could find, and having not done any martial arts myself, I had no personal experience to fall back upon in this instance. The admiration of Saul Bass turned out to be very fruitful, as well as movie posters, I could look into opening sequences, which would allow me to further my abilities in animation, which was an area that I had thoroughly enjoyed in the past, and therefore the theme that I took forward to completion. I focused on the title design part of Saul Bass's career, and started to look at several of his sequences. These included Around the World in 80 Days, Anatomy of a Murder, Vertigo, Psycho, Ocean's 11, and Casino. I looked at the way that lines are used as transitional tools, and how characters and objects simply travel between scenes. I also noted the way that credits flow along, sometimes imaginary lines, and intermingle among the layers of the whole scene. One of the titles that Harj brought to my attention was Catch Me If You Can. Although I later discovered that Saul Bass did not create this title sequence, Harj had placed great emphasis on it, and it is the only homage to Saul Bass that I could find that is in the context of a feature-length film. I therefore took elements from this, such as the typeface and entrances of text. With what I had noticed about icons in some of the sequences that I have watched, I decided to make several ideas for icons that I could use in my own. Though I did not end up using many of these, there are some features in my intro and others which are included in a form that I hadn't drawn at this point. Before proceeding to my storyboard, I listed some aspects of Harj's life that could be portrayed in my animation in the same way that actors' and producers' names are in ordinary productions. I also wrote a brief timeline which would inform how I planned my storyboard, almost taking the role that a thumbnail would have for most other outcomes before the scamp stage. My first attempt at a storyboard was rather crude, although it gave me enough information to understand what would be happening. A discussion with my teacher revealed that a more developed storyboard would not only allow me to understand what would be happening, but I would know, and would also have a good idea of how these things happen. For the beginning and title in this sequence, I researched the cover of Haj's favourite book, A Brief History of Time. I was delighted to discover that a documentary had been made from this, and that meant that I could reference this in almost a replica, rather than just the title layout, as I had thought would be the case. The downward strokes in the name Harjit Dogra allowed me to then incorporate this iconic feature from Saul-Bass's work and extend these to become decorative lines, which would then pan across to reveal the beginning of Haj's life as a baby in a cot. I then lowered the cot and extended the arms to imply growth, which was then taken to the next stage with a school blazer added, as the introduction to his school life. Haj's character then turns to walk into the school building, thus incorporating the idea mentioned earlier of an object simply travelling between scenes. This was also to hold on to the simplicity, as the figure is then seen to be seated, ready for the transition to the aeroplane scene, which is a reference to Haj's love of travel. I used the similarity in shapes of cloud and bush to then link this to Haj's story of when he came face to face with a lion while on safari in a topless jeep. From here, I zoomed out to Kilimanjaro of Tanzania, as this was a direct connection to his heritage, and it was a simple enough mound to then progress to being a link to food. I then used lines to remove this character and form trees, which I would lead typical African safari animals, followed by the character portraying Haj. This would then zoom out again to result in Haj falling from what is now guitar strings, followed by the addition of colour, which is then revealed to be drawn by a marker pen, one of Haj's favourite mediums, which then goes on to draw the ring box from which rises the engagement ring that he proposed with. This ring then slips onto his fiancée's finger before being homed in on to reveal a silhouette of the couple with lips locked. It was not until after completing the animated sequence that I added the credits, as it was only at this point that I knew when there would be suitable spaces and times for the words to appear. Aside from a few minor alterations, such as colours and shapes of objects, I held very strongly to the set sequence I had drawn as a storyboard. Having such a detailed storyboard meant that this was the most productive way to create my animation. The music is that of Haj's choosing, as I had noticed that in Saul-Bass's sequences, the music does not explicitly match the imagery. I felt that it would therefore be necessary to instead match the music to Haj's personality. Ready for the Floor by Hot Chip was Haj's answer to my inquiry, what is the soundtrack to your life? And is therefore the music that plays in the title sequence of the hypothetical film about his life.
I'm ready for a fall. Instead of calling up the wall, why don't you open up, retort? We're ready for the floor. I can't hear your voice, do I have a choice? I'm hoping with chance you might take the stance. I can't hear your voice, do I have a choice?
You're sinking below, I'm using my force.
I'm hoping with chance you might take the stance. You're my number